Welcome everybody to the CPPA technical presentation this morning. I hope we're coming through loud and clear. This morning's presentation is Phytocaps, an introduction to renewable.
Carly, you're totally muted.
I don't know why that has muted me automatically. So can you hear me again?
I can hear you now, yeah.
Perfect. I think my is muting itself randomly, so hopefully it doesn't do that again. Okay, so Spirit of Reconciliation. The Closure Planning Practitioners Association acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. And we pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. So just a note so that everyone's aware, this webinar is being recorded, and that recording will be available on our website hopefully within the next week or so. And yes, I am logged in twice. We had some technical issues with sound this morning, so effectively I'm actually logged in via my phone for audio and video on the laptop, unfortunately. Teams does seem to be giving us a run for our money at the moment. So just some webinar etiquette before we get into the presentation. We effectively like you to keep the cameras and your microphones off as much as possible during the presentation. And if you do have a question, please pop it in the chat. If you need to contact us at all, we'll be monitoring that chat. Or raise your hand and we'll jump into your questions towards the end of the presentation. The CPPA has a vision to promote global leading practice skills in closure within Australia, and we do this by representing and engaging with closure planning practitioners to develop and build professional capacity. If you have a great closure planning story to share or would like to present for the CPPA, please contact us via the website, via the link there, or click the QR code and send us a note. Otherwise, let any of the CPPA representatives know and we will organise to have a chat with you and get you presenting on this particular forum. Our next aspect is really thanking our sponsors. CPPA couldn't do the great work that we do without our sponsors. We have a number of tiered sponsors, particularly our O'Kane sponsor is our gold sponsor, and we have a number of silver sponsors as well. So thank you very much to all our sponsors and your ongoing support in that space. We'd really like to also just raise our upcoming events. We have the AGM coming up in the next couple of weeks, so please make sure that you register for that, as well as vote for the management committee coming up for the next year. You can do that via our website. As you can see here, there's a snapshot of events there, and also go to our website to check out those events and also register there for the CPPA AGM. So the other thing you can do to be advised of upcoming events is become an ordinary member and or a corresponding member for free at this particular link. It's great when we have a number of ordinary members because all of our emails go out to our ordinary members. So please consider joining us to be part of CPPA. You can also keep up with our events and so on via the mobile app. This app is really fantastic. It helps you to identify when events coming up, sends you reminders, things like that, as well as helps you to register really easily. So you can download the app via either the Google Play Store or the App Store. So just pop that through. If you're having any issues with the app, please feel free to contact us. Okay, so without further ado, we'll get into this morning's presentation, which is Phytocapping: An Introduction to a New Approach by Dr. Melissa Salt, who's joined us on the line. Just to introduce Melissa, she's a senior principal scientist with ATC Williams and a certified professional soil scientist with 30 years experience providing environmental solutions in the mining, waste and construction industries. Thank you for joining us, Melissa. Melissa has worked for state government agencies, consultants and construction companies around Australia, and over her career is focused on rehabilitation and beneficial reuse of waste materials such as wastewater, biosolids, trommel fines, etc. In 2013, Melissa completed her PhD on water balance and the influence of temporal factors on final cappings for landfills, which compared to compacted clay barriers and phytocaps with trials in five Australian states. Melissa now provides specialised advice on the design, construction and maintenance of cover systems and phytocaps for rehabilitation of mine waste storage facilities and landfills. That's quite an introduction there, Melissa. So I'll get you now, Melissa, to share your screen. And as I said, thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thanks, Kylie. I'll swap to you also admitting people. So as Kylie mentioned, we have had a couple of technical difficulties. So hopefully we can overcome those. So good afternoon, everyone, or morning, depending on where you are. And thanks for coming along today. I appreciate the opportunity to present to you some of my research and field trials. As Kylie mentioned, my thesis focused around landfill rehabilitation, and there are some really obvious differences between landfill and mining rehab, but some of the research is obviously relevant to both, and the lessons I've learnt since are also relevant to both. So this morning, what I wanted to talk to you, or this afternoon, what I wanted to talk to you is about, for a start, the performance of clay barriers. That was actually part of the trial work that I did do. And I wanted to provide a bit of research from Australia and from overseas. I'll then talk about what a phytocap is and how they perform. And finally, just talking about a couple of aspects of design and maintenance that are really key and that differentiate phytocaps from something like a store and release cover. Before I start though, one thing I wanted to do was to make sure we're all talking the same language when it comes to the soil water balance. So most terms are the same, so precipitation, evapotranspiration, runoff, soil moisture storage, those sorts of things. I also talk about lateral flow, which is basically the horizontal flow that occurs within the profile, and that's often caused by a change in pore space relations. So that's sort of the term that I've got here. The other term that I tend to use is drainage, so that D sort of factor. So drainage also gets called things like percolation or bottom flux or those sorts of things. But basically, it's the moisture that leaves the cover and enters the underlying waste. So whether that's tailings, whether it's rock, putrescible waste or contaminated soil. So I tend to use the term drainage, or you'll also see percolation used as well. I tend to reserve the term infiltration to basically just mean the moisture that enters from the air-soil interface, so not to confuse that with drainage, okay? So throughout the presentation, they're the sorts of terms that I'll be using. So I'll start with compacted clay barriers. So final covers for containment of waste are often based on a barrier system to prevent the moisture leaching contaminants into the environment. The assumption in the design is that the barrier stays compact over time and that a barrier system is the best method to prevent moisture movement into an entombed waste. However, 25 years ago, this was proven to be a flawed assumption. In Germany, in 1997, Melchior measured increasing drainage over an 8-year period from conventional compacted barriers. So the barrier basically had 750 mil of cover soil, a 250 mil drainage layer, and then a 600 mil compacted clay. Melchior did dye tracer studies and excavated the covers and found small fissures from desiccation that was then actually followed, so from later investigations, followed by penetration of roots into and through that compacted layer. The permeability of the compacted layer increased, so initially placed at 1 by 10 to the minus 10 metres per second at construction. After 2 years was down to 2 by 10 to the minus 9, and after 5 years had increased to 1 by 10 to the minus 7 metres per second. Similar trials have been done in the USA. So in 1998, the Alternative Cover Assessment Program was initiated by the US EPA to measure the performance of their prescribed barrier caps and compare those with alternative cover designs at 12 sites around the US. Compacted barriers were included, and with 2 of those were in humid regions. So that's what you can see over here. So there's the Albany cap and the Cedar Rapids cap. So both of those were in humid regions, and both had drainage from both of them of 52 millimetres and 195 millimetres per year. So that's equivalent to about 6 to 17% of the precipitation received. Excavation was done of the Albany cap about 4 years after construction, and they found that the hydraulic conductivity had increased by about 3 orders of magnitude. They also did dye tracing studies and did some structural analysis as well that showed extensive cracking and root development throughout the entire depth of the barrier layer. Now in Australia, I actually repeated some of those tests. So the Australian Alternative Cover Assessment Program was what I did my doctoral thesis under, and that commenced in 2006 and looked at both compacted clay barrier caps and Phytocaps over time. So I actually ran a series of box trials, so large apple boxes. They're about 1 metre by 1 metre by about 2 metres tall. And I looked at the soil hydraulic changes over time, and they can occur due to, say, changes in dry density from compaction and settlement, pore size distribution changes, and particle aggregation and disaggregation. Both the Phytocap and conventional cap were planted to native grasses in this trial, and after 11 months, roots were noted to over 1 metre's depth, which means they'd penetrated into the compacted clay barrier layer. The soil physical properties changed markedly over that first 11 months and then remained at about that same level when they were measured again at 16 months and then again at 4¼ years after construction. As you can see in the table presented there, the dry density decreased while saturated moisture content and saturated hydraulic conductivity increased. The other observation that was made was that because we actually irrigated them to force them to wet and dry more frequently, as well as exposing them to natural rainfall, when we irrigated them, drainage actually commenced really quickly, but then ceased. These are actually combined with field trials that we did. So the field scale trials included 10 metre by 20 metre non-weighing lysimeters. One of my trial sites was based in Adelaide, and it included 600 mil compacted clay with 900 mil of growing medium over the top. From 2007 to 2014, the rainfall varied from about 360 mil to just over 700 millimetres a year. And you can see in the graph provided here that this probe here, which was actually at 1.35 metres, so that's about 450 mil into that compacted clay barrier layer, initially retained sort of that same level of moisture, but after the first year it actually started drying, and then in subsequent years you can actually see that it is wetting and drying in line with moisture moving through the profile. So at this point here where it started to dry, the roots actually hadn't extended to this point. You can tell that because this probe here that's at 900 mils depth, that's basically sitting on top of that compacted clay barrier, that shows no sign of roots accessing moisture. But you can see by sort of the middle of 2009, so about 2 years after construction, that roots had started to get to this level and were actually drying at that point as well. So if we look at this in a little bit more detail, so just honing in on those sort of winter periods in 2009 and 2010, so the drying of the clay resulted in drainage actually being recorded. So again, we've got, so the green line here, that's sitting on top of the compacted clay barrier, and the white line is within the barrier. We have the lateral flow, so we actually measured the moisture that was running across the surface of that compacted clay barrier, and then also the drainage is this yellow line. So in 2009, the drainage, it's a bit hard to see here, but the drainage actually commenced before lateral flow commenced. Whereas in 2010, no drainage, only lateral flow. Now, 2009 actually had a lower rainfall of 663 millimetres compared with 708 in 2010. But if you look at the change in soil moisture content, particularly at the top of the cut clay, so this green line, you can see in 2009 the moisture content increased rapidly. And drainage commenced before the clay was actually saturated. Whereas in the following year, the top of the clay actually wet up more slowly, most likely allowing it for any cracks that have formed to have actually sealed. So it wouldn't have allowed any preferential flow through. In 2012 and 2013, lateral flow actually commenced before drainage, but drainage still occurred in both of these years. Now in 2012, more drainage was reported than in previous or subsequent years, even though the rainfall was actually only 462 mils in 2012. The major difference is that you can see that this compacted clay barrier is now below 25% moisture, whereas all the previous ones and subsequent ones, it actually was above 25% moisture at that beginning of winter. So overall, the drainage from the conventional clay cap actually exceeded the Phytocap in both of these years. So one thing that's obvious from both the overseas and Australian research is that the clay barrier has changed since it was placed, and this has resulted in worse than expected performance. So what is a Phytocap? It's basically a nature-based solution that uses natural analogues to develop a long-term sustainable ecosystem compatible with the site's proposed after uses. Phytocapping considers climate, vegetation and soil properties, as does store and release covers, but for a phytocap, the focus is not just on the water balance, but also includes more detailed soil chemistry and vegetation considerations. So just going back to the water balance for a sec, as for all final cover for rehabilitation, the primary aim is to control that movement of moisture into the underlying waste, so to reduce drainage. Unlike most cover systems prescribed by regulators, phytocaps and store and release caps actually use the natural water balance to minimise drainage. The reason that they can do this is actually figures based from Australian research on natural systems, is that ET accounts for such a large proportion of rainfall losses in a natural environment. So if we can make small changes to ET by increasing it, we can actually make relatively large changes to the potential drainage. Now, the Australian Alternative Cover Assessment Program, as I mentioned, actually also measured water balance in phytocaps around Australia. So each used the locally available soil and the endemic vegetation, and all of these caps are around about 1.5 to 1.7 metres thick. So over the trial period, the rainfall and drainage varied markedly. Now, I should just point out that I actually talk about a thing called the weather year. So you'll see here, these are not years as in a calendar year nor a financial year, but a weather year basically helps to keep the rainfall and drainage together. So the drainage could be delayed after rainfall by, weeks or months, and hence by assessing the data based on these weather years that start at the commencement of the wet season and conclude in the dry season provides a more relevant assessment. So the things that are probably interesting to note in these data is, one thing is with Townsville. So in weather years 2 and 4, there's actually sort of reasonably similar rainfall, but a markedly different amount of drainage in each of these years. And particularly weather year 4 is the later one, so the vegetation was even more developed, and yet we got a lot more drainage. The issue with that was the majority of rainfall in weather year 2 was actually caused by a tropical cyclone, which dumped about 1 metre of rain in just a few days. So we had a lot more runoff from that. Whereas in weather year 4, 3 consecutive months received over the 90th percentile in rainfall. So that constant rainfall leads to much higher drainage. For all sites except Perth, the mean drainage over the monitoring period represented less than 10% of the rainfall. And all the results are variable due to seasonality and intensity. There were marked improvements in the performance. A standout here is Melbourne in the final year, when almost double the annual rainfall was received, but only 2% of that reported as drainage. For Lismore, it's actually more difficult to identify any pattern. It actually seems that it performed worse in that third year. However, if we look at Lismore in more detail, the change in the drainage pattern is clearer when you compare the moisture content at the base of the profile. I do have to apologise, there is a typo in this graph. That moisture content should be at 1.35 metres, not 1.15 metres. However, initially, anyway, the drainage seeped from the base of the profile almost continuously. You can see the drainage here just constantly increasing throughout that period. But after about 18 months, the roots of the vegetation were accessing the deeper profile. You can see that we've gone from the moisture content just sort of bumbling around between sort of 30 and 40% to all of a sudden showing marked peaks and troughs, which is really indicative of roots starting to access that area. And once that started to occur, you can see there's a massive change in the way that the drainage comes out of the profile. So rather than just seeping out the base, we have short episodes of drainage occurring where we're getting that higher infiltration through. So we've looked at that Phytocaps can control moisture as store and release caps can again. So how do you design these to actually achieve these low drainage rates? Similar to store and release cover, the first steps are actually looking at the climate data, characterising the soil properties that we're interested in. So looking at the soil physical properties like texture and structure. So not only the structure about the soil aggregates, but also any dispersion. And then particularly as they affect the hydraulic properties of moisture retention and hydraulic conductivity. For the plants, typically define a rooting depth and water use. The metric there is often, say, leaf area index, and also some aspects around their seasonality. And then these are all combined into a water balance model that's used to help predict the drainage. It's really important to remember that water balance models are not accurate, but precise, and their power is in comparing the options. Before you start modelling the water balance, make sure you understand the data you're putting in, or as my first boss used to say, rubbish in, rubbish out. So for these modelling predictions, it's important to use the most accurate data you can and recognise modelling is an estimate of reality and not the truth. We can use published data, laboratory data or field data for the water balance model. The accuracy of prediction improves with each. So laboratory data are actually a great start compared to just using sort of published values that are based around soil texture. Remembering though that laboratory values are often from remoulded samples and don't necessarily cover the heterogeneity that is present in a larger soil profile. So the most accurate data that you can use, which is pretty obvious, is using that field data. But as you can see, it's still not 100%. So our models have to simplify the soil behaviour, or it would take months or even years to resolve all the equations, even if that is possible. So you can improve that modelling prediction, but it's still not 100% accurate. Edaphic properties are the soil chemical and physical properties that affect plant growth. And this is where a phytocap builds on a store and release cover. So the focus of the cover becomes how we can best establish and provide for the plants selected and which plants should we select to grow. The soil properties need to be correctly interpreted. I don't have time today to teach you the relationship and independence of the soil property. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this text and it is awesome, but like many things, a little bit of knowledge can be dangerous. If you don't understand the interrelationship between pH, cation exchange, aeration and availability, then use a CPSS, so a Certified Professional Soil Scientist. The values in the Hazelton and Murphy book are great for describing the soil, but not for interpreting it. And it is mainly geared around agricultural soil. So they're actually looking at sort of optimum soil conditions, something that is rarely available from an overburden stockpile. It is really important to get the right people on the job and to listen to their advice. So this is what happens when you don't follow the advice of your soil scientist. Even the best efforts of the vegetation contractor cannot overcome the fact that you didn't follow the amelioration required to fix some of the properties of the available overburden used for the final cover. The vegetation may grow well initially, but the seed doesn't set and even weeds can struggle to grow. But the right soil amelioration combined with the right vegetation contractor can yield excellent results. This site is actually near Geelong and was constructed as designed, so it had all the soil amelioration that we needed, but it initially suffered from a lack of maintenance, mainly due to changing staff on the owner's side. It was constructed in 2017 and by 2021 it was mainly poa grass, so there's larger grass as you can see here, and weeds. A new manager, a new vegetation contractor, and re-engagement of the designer, and that was me, and things have turned around. So weed control, additional plantings and supplementary irrigation since that time has resulted in a massive increase in the presence and diversity of the native vegetation. The drainage from this site in the 23-24 weather year was 0 millimetres, though rainfall occurs throughout the year with an average of over 50 millimetres a year. So a really great improvement by just getting that vegetation right. So talking more about vegetation, so that other major piece in designing a Phytocap is that vegetation. The selection of the vegetation has to be aligned to the after use, but it also has to be suitable for the soil. Although the overburden is the natural soil of the area, it is actually often a mix of much deeper units and hence may not have the same properties as the natural areas surrounding. Also, any impacts from the underlying waste can become important in plant selection. For example, gaseous impacts from things like putrescible waste can have a similar effect to waterlogging as they reduce the oxygen content in the soil. This means that the vegetation you select may actually be, say, from a swampy area in the native environment and not the woodland that actually surrounds your site, so that you can ensure that you're still using local species, but that they will survive. The most important factor of all, though, is variety. Not only does this result in a more natural environment, but also helps to protect the site during the myriad of conditions experienced, and whether that's related to weather, fire, or herbivores grazing. During the establishment phase, I can't mention the importance of weed control enough, though I have tried to here. Native vegetation establishment is slow and you need to allow at least 5 years of more intensive maintenance to ensure their survival. This might seem like a long time, but it's actually more expensive to replant native vegetation than to invest in the maintenance. So some order of magnitude, so the cost of planting vegetation around, say, $200,000 for 10 hectares, that can pay for a lot of labour for an experienced vegetation contractor, the cost of which is typically around $20,000 a year. So an overall savings over that 5-year period of around about 50% compared to having to replant that vegetation. Before I finish, the question I often get asked is what happens if the trees fall over? Won't they expose the underlying waste or create preferential pathways leading to leachate? A paper was written, actually it's a book, was written back in 1955 on this matter. The majority of roots for eucalypts are in the upper ½ metre and the roots fracture as the tree falls over. So you end up with a divot that's sort of ½ metre deep. It doesn't take out the full, 5 or 10 metres of root ball that's actually there. Also, when trees fall over, you go back and repair and replace as part of typical maintenance, the same way that you would for any erosion. If it occurs outside of the maintenance period, then the low spot will become a sediment trap and will start to fill up, but it also becomes a moist area where new seedlings will grow. It's important to remember also that this will be a very small portion of the cap and not failure of the entire cap. If you have a variety of vegetation, you will still have shrubs and grasses to use the moisture whilst a larger tree re-establishes. So my take-home messages really are to think about what you are modelling and if it will really perform like that. Clay barriers do not stay compact, whether you place them under a capillary break, below a metre of soil, or do excessive praying, they don't stay that way. So why not place them in a way that you can use them actually within a Phytocap? Phytocaps are really an amped up store and release cover. You need to consider more aspects during design, so it does cost more to analyse and assess the soil and select, source and establish the right vegetation species. But the returns are in the lack of rework and the reduced risk of failure, which could potentially lead to fines due to off-site pollution from sediment or from the waste itself. make sure you get the right people doing the right job and listen to them. The long-term peace of mind is worth it, both in terms of money and outcome. My final slide shows one of the most picturesque landfills I've had the pleasure to be involved with. So thank you all for listening. I hope I've given you some food for thought for the next time you're looking at your rehabilitation. If you do have any questions, you can ask me now or feel free to contact me later.
Thanks so much.
I'll hand it back to you, Kylie.
Thank you, Melissa. Okay.
Can do.
Yeah, excellent. So that was a really fantastic presentation. And I have questions myself, which I'm sure if you've seen any examples where this has been applied into, I suppose, areas where the soil is very rich in clay or similar, this is something you could see if it will work, that could be used in areas where we're potentially rehabilitating tailings facilities from wet tails. So just want to see like what types of materials have been used in the landfill in the landfill kind of capping process from the phytocaps.
So we've used a really broad variety of materials. So even if I just sort of talk initially about the Australian Alternative Cap Assessment Program. So for that, Lismore was basically a clay soil, basalt derived, so volcanic, shrink swell potential, that sort of stuff. So that was quite a clay soil. I've got another site actually that has a similar soil to that, all the way through to much sort of sandier measures. So the Melbourne site was actually a mixture of sort of a sandy loam soil with a really low grade compost. So that was actually mixed throughout the profile to help actually improve its moisture holding capacity. During my talk, I did mention, so the Perth site was in there. The Perth site was pretty much straight sand, but the big failure for that site was actually that it wasn't maintained. So effectively, beach sand is a no, as it is for almost any cap, because it just doesn't have any sort of moisture storage whatsoever. But beyond that, there's lots of different materials. So I've got sites that have also used things like quarry scalps as well. So that's been just a sort of a 20 to 50 mil nondescript rock, or even a minus 20 mil nondescript rock. So those sorts of sites are out there as well, and crushed shales, all that sort of stuff too. So really broad variety of soil or soil-like materials can be used, but it's just a matter of really assessing what plants it is you're going to put on there, what do you need to do to sort of give those plants the best shot, and that might be looking at mulches or other sorts of additives to help overcome that.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that. We've been doing some work on at Fortescue on looking at wet tailings and the and effectively the combining topsoils instead of having to cap with significant rock armour or rocking material at closure. And it does look like the big issue is, what are we going to grow and what kind of additives are we going to use? So I think it's definitely very clear from your presentation as a soil scientist that that's probably the key takeaway. But I think that this type of approach and the results that you've shown here definitely align with the findings that we're getting out of some of the work that we've been doing up at site. So I definitely talking about this with you at a later date, I think. We do have a couple of questions on the chat, so we'll just jump through those. Andrew, did you want to ask your question, Andrew Mack, or you're happy for us to ask it for you?
Yeah, fire away, Kylie.
So Andrew's just asking, on average, what depth of cover is required in your experience?
So it obviously varies depending on what plant species you're growing and what your climate's like. The rule of thumb I always start with is about 1.5 meters. But where you're growing things like predominantly native grasses and you've got a much more arid environment, you can sort of pull that back to being sort of closer to that metre sort of mark. I wouldn't go much shallower than 1 metre. Mainly, and again, obviously, that really depends on what waste you've got sitting underneath that and what the properties of that are. You really have to take that into account as well. But yeah, so you're looking at probably 1.5 meters is about where I like to start from.
Yeah, great. Andrew, did you have any follow-up questions on that?
No, that's all good. Thank you.
Okay, and so we have one as well from Katie Carter. Katie, did you want to ask your question?
I guess I can. So, Mel, in terms of your characterisation requirements and obviously the variability in the soil materials, sort of looking at the vegetation types or a grazing post-mining land use, like, I guess I'm sort of keen to understand what sort of characterisation you'd be looking at, and have the trials on the caps sort of address these types of different sort of post-mining land use and re-veg types.
So the re-veg types for a phytocap are typically driven more towards that native veg end of town, but that doesn't exclude grazing. It's just a matter of making sure that the vegetation that you're going to put in there is suitable for grazing. So, whether that's your wallaby grasses, your kangaroo grasses, your red grasses, whatever it is, the reason for aiming more towards those natives is actually to make sure you've got plants that are accessing the entire soil profile. One of the things I see too often is that people sort of think a plant is a plant is a plant, and they'll go in and just put in, a relatively shallow rooted species that only maybe accesses sort of the top 1/2 metre of the soil. You've then got 1/2 metre or more of soil just sitting there with nothing actually using the veg out of it. So there's nothing wrong with having that being a grazed pasture. Again, like some of the trial sites I've had have been native grasses only. Others have been far more, rainforest type species, like the Townsville site was far more rainforest and had very little understory underneath it. Adelaide was all grasses. Melbourne was a bit of a mixture of the two. So we've done a range of different sorts of things with that, just depending on what that final use is, and what that environment needs. Once you get above, so another rule of thumb, once you get above about 500 mil a year, you really need to start thinking about having shrubs and trees in that sort of vegetation mix because of that water use. So under about 500 mil a year, like I said, this is a massive rule of thumb. Under about 500 mil a year, the drainage is predominantly limited, or the water use is limited by rainfall, whereas after that you've got excess moisture, so you need plants with much higher water use requirements like shrubs and trees to be able to sort of work with that. But again, you're not trying to grow a rainforest in an arid area. You're not trying to do that. You're trying to replicate what that natural vegetation is and thinking about those after uses. But phytocaps are thinking more about that natural veg and really maximising out on that ET. Can I answer you, Katie?
Sure did. Thanks, Mel. That was amazing.
Yeah, I think I've got a bit of a question to follow on from that. So from a grazing pressure perspective, what kinds of impacts? So obviously you get the rehab going, it's all going fantastic. And, if you get to a space where you're overgrazing and you effectively, it's a similar, like from a herbivore perspective, even a pest herbivore perspective. Can you see that there'd be, if you're outside that maintenance period, what would that look like, kind of, I guess, sign-off wise around the potential for that to fail if you don't have plants providing that moisture uptake if they've been fairly, really overgrazed?
So either that would be within an agricultural system or within a natural system. So within a natural system, as that vegetation decreases, those animals, so presumably kangaroos would be the main sort of one you're probably thinking about there, they'll tend to move off-site. And by the time you've got to the fact, your aftercare period is decades. It's not 1 or 2 years. It's 10, 20, 30 years depending on your site and what it is you've contained. So within that time you've typically got enough seed bed there for it to be able to deal with 1 or 2 dry years or lower rainfall years or a bit of overgrazing pressure. Within an agricultural sense, it has to be controlled far more, but one would hope that you have a grazier who is sensitive to the fact that site needs to remain fairly well covered, or it might well be that you've got to set up contractual relationships to deal with that. The fact that you've used a phytocap, though, is actually giving that vegetation the best chance. So within that sort of establishment period, you've really promoted that vegetation to become established and to be the dominant force there. Even after that time, like I find with my sites, so a number of sites I don't actually plant things like some of the really drought tolerant plants, things like the salt bushes, blue bushes, that sort of stuff. They will come in, but what it allows me to do is to get a broader variety of species established before you start getting those salt bushes come in. And then you will have weeds come in at some point as well, but they'll be in a minor sort of capacity. You've got good seed there and good establishment of your native vegetation. And once it's established, it's pretty hardy in terms of those things. Not that hardy, like you need to pick your species appropriately for grazing though. That's probably the big one. Like for cattle grazing.
So I suppose for us rehab kind of people like, you know, professionals, it's really about kind of setting up that seed bank for success as well, in terms of, you know, the types of materials you're using and potentially even the age of your topsoil or ancillary, you know, seeding into that topsoil mix by the sounds of things will give it a really good start in that space. I think probably from my perspective, it's a bit more feral herbivores that we tend to have around the Pilbara as well, putting pressure on the system. Yeah, absolutely. But I think from what you said, you definitely factor that in. We've got another question on here from Andrew. So I'll read that one given your response last time, Andrew. Have you factored in future climate change fluctuations and extremes into phytocap performance long term as part of your work?
So yes, through that. So same as you do for store and release caps basically through using the water balance, just to look at how that might impact things. I use a different modelling program from most people. So I use a CSIRO program that actually has a feedback loop between soil, climate and vegetation. So I'm not just actually putting in a year after year leaf area index and assuming that it stays the same year in, year out. Mine's actually sort of a more dynamic model than that. It's sort of a big leaf model effectively. So it does actually allow that feedback a little bit better for climate change. But you can still do that as you do with store and release covers now by using that data that's available on Silo and then modifying your leaf area index based on what that climate would be like. Did that sort of answer the guts of it, Andrew? Or were you thinking more about that change of vegetation and succession that could occur in the future?
It was a little bit of both, to be honest. I'm interested in sort of that reduction in rainfall, but also the fluctuations, or I guess the changes in vegetation types as things progress.
I guess part of that is like I don't have trials that look at that because that's over a much longer period than I've looked at anything so far. Part of the proofing of that is about using that native veg, so stuff that is actually sort of suitable for that area. So that's the reason for focusing on phytocaps with native vegetation, because it is more likely to be adaptable. And also by having that variety of species, so making sure that you've got a whole range of different types of vegetation, different species of vegetation in there to try and proof against that sort of potential impact of climate change. So that's where those sorts of things sit in that realm.
Just on that note, from your modelling, in that model that you mentioned, the CSIRO one, is there, you know, your inputs from a rainfall perspective, are you using, you know, ARR, like the Australian Rainfall and Runoff, like climate change metrics, or are you using something else that might input to that?
So what I have been using is so the Silo data site, depending on what state you're in. So Queensland, it's great. Silo have a whole lot of information around climate change metrics. So they've actually developed sort of daily climate files for 2050 and 2090 off the top of my head. There was some specific work that I did looking at that about 2 years ago. I'd have to go back and look at that to be sure. But basically it was downloading those files from the Silo database and using those. But you can also do things like there's lots of metrics that you can apply. So you can take, say, a silo database from, say, 1970 to 2020, and actually use some of the expected changes to modify that to sort of replicate a 50-year in the future sort of look. So there's a couple of ways that you can look at doing it depending on where you are and what data you've got available.
And it sounds like we could definitely contact you after this to have a conversation about that if we chose to. We've got one last question, I think, on the chat. So Christine, Lizen, did you want to ask a question? You're okay for me to do it?
No, it's a short and sweet question, so go ahead, Kylie.
Thank you. Does metal uptake by plants need to be considered for underlying material that may be heavily enriched with metals? Have you come across that in your experience so far?
Yeah, so it's a question that was often asked with landfills as well, but the risk is actually reduced by the soil that you're using. So for the vast majority of the plants, over 90% of their roots are actually within that top sort of half metre, and that top sort of, it's actually more like about 20 centimetres where you've got all those fine roots. That's where plants predominantly take up all the metals and all of those sorts of things from. So they will take up small amounts from deeper, but a lot of the deeper roots are actually there for structural purposes and then also for some water uptake. They've got a whole lot more exclusion mechanisms, so there are a lot woodier roots and those sorts of things that are deeper in the profile that actually limit that amount of heavy metal that can be taken up. So that's something that I actually looked at with a couple of other people. So David Francis, who's based in Queensland, and I had a bit of a look at that a couple of years ago. There was some research that was done out of Southern Cross Uni that suggested that metal uptake from the waste could potentially impact koalas. So we were asked specifically about that, and basically what we showed is that it's actually not an issue.
Yeah, great. I think that would
short
be
summary of what we looked at.
Up in the Pilbara. Fantastic. So did we have any other questions from anyone online? All right. Well, thank you so much again, Melissa, for your presentation. It was really fantastic and definitely gave me a huge amount of food for thought. So hopefully everyone else listening got as much out of it. And thanks for everyone listening as well for being patient and tolerant while we worked through our technical issues earlier. We definitely think we got around it, but it's never 100% when you're dealing with technology. So thanks again, Melissa. And if anybody's got any further questions for Melissa, please don't hesitate to send them through. And Melissa has indicated that she'd be happy for you to reach out to her as well if you've got questions or you'd be interested in hearing more about her work.
Fantastic. Thanks, Kylie. Thanks, everyone. Really appreciate your time and your interest.
Lovely. All right. Well, thanks again. Have a great day, everybody.
See you later.
See ya.